Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour une nouvelle conférence virtuelle du CDTS. I am delighted to welcome you today for a new CLTS virtual talk. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barito. I am an associate professor of law, the University Research Chair in Technology and Society, and the director of the University of Ottawa Center for Law, Technology and Society. For today's virtual talk, I am delighted to welcome Professor Sofia Ranchordas, who is a professor within the Faculty of Law of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Sofia Ranchordas conducts research on public law and technology from an interdisciplinary perspective. Research interests include the study of data-driven regulation, the impact of big tech on fundamental rights and good administration, as well as new approaches to better regulation and innovation policy. She has advised the Dutch government and the European Commission on several matters regarding the regulation of the new technological development. And today she will share with us some of her ongoing research on citizenship in the digital context, discussing digital inclusion, but mostly digital exclusion from a legal perspective. So without further ado, I will give the virtual floor to Professor Ranchordas for about half an hour, and then I will moderate the Q&A session. Thank you. Sofia, you can switch on your camera and your mic.
Thank you very much, Florian. I hope everyone can understand me and hear me very well. So thank you, first of all, to Florian Martin Barito et WIDAD for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, even if it's just virtually. Today, I'm going to present an ongoing project of mine that I titled 6 Degrees of Digital Separation, because it has to do with part of the presentation of today. And basically, I'm now quite interested in analyzing the topic of digital exclusion from a legal perspective. And this is something that quite a lot of people have done from a more interdisciplinary perspective, that there is quite a lot of research on digital divide. But I think more than ever, I think it's important to talk about the legal implications of digital exclusion. So nowadays, with the pandemic, we see basically that everything has gone online, and this is actually not the digital government is not an exception. It's actually the best example. I'm an administrative lawyer, so everything that I will say basically applies mostly to the digitization of public government. And one of the phenomena that I have seen is that there are a lot of people that think that now that we are, all of us are at home, or mostly at home, working and learning remotely, that there will be a push for more online activities, for more online meetings, more online education. And of course, it has its failures, but there are some alternatives that everyone can have access to. And this is actually probably true for 80% of the population in Western countries, as we know, but there are still quite a lot of people that are being left out. And I'm very interested in this 20% of the population in developed countries. It's much more in other countries that is actually being left out. And because what I'm interested in is actually the reasons why they're being left out, the reasons why these people that actually have access, at least in theory, they have access in theory to the internet, to digital means, they're still not using them. They're still not able to really participate in our digital society. So this is something that has been present in the media, especially in the last 2 years. I found this small news about Canada, but I'm sure there are many more news regarding the digital divide in Canada, which of course very often is presented as something which is mainly connected to lack of access. But when you actually look closer, it's not only about lack of access. There's much more underlying that. I'm personally not very much acquainted with the Canadian reality. I really look forward to your comments because I'm sure there is much more to say about digital divide in Canada, but I'm personally not very well acquainted, so I will focus my analysis mostly on Europe, on the European context, and some of what I know from the United States. So the UK is probably the best example for this, because in the UK you have actually right now a policy which is very much focused on having as much digital government as possible. There has been a switch from digital when appropriate to digital by default. And in the last 2 years, you have seen quite a lot of criticism in English media regarding the problem of access to digital government. Now with the pandemic, one would say that it has gotten a little bit worse, because in the UK you have quite a lot of inequality in general. So just economic inequality, social inequality, of course, like in many other countries. But you see that this push for digitalization is actually affecting a number of people, that especially people that are on welfare, because many of social welfare benefits have all gone online. If you want to apply for social welfare benefits, most of the time you actually have to go online, and it's quite difficult to actually file them face to face like most people used to. So what you see basically here in the UK, and also in other countries, but I think UK is a good example, is that the people that need the government the most are the people that are most affected by this switch to digitization, because on the one hand, they need these benefits, they need actually administrative decisions that are being automated. But at the same time, these are also the people that have very often low education, that are low income, that might actually not have the motivation to learn on how to use digital means. And because of that, there is a growing tendency that these people will be excluded. So this is something that I find particularly interesting. And when you read the media, you see quite extreme accounts of this exclusion. So for example, I found this one quite interesting because it sounds quite extreme. And it has to do with the fact that people might have access to digital means. But the thing is, there are also a lot of people that actually have to think about data as they have access to the internet through their phones, but they only have access through pay as you go, which basically means that data is quite expensive. They have to choose what to actually, how they'll use their money, and sometimes the choice is between data and basic supply. So in that sense, you see that it might sound as if everyone has access to the internet, everyone can actually use it, but in practice, you see that even those who do have access still are not able to really use it as easily as probably most of us that are actually now online are. And when you actually are talking about making it essential to actually use digital means to have access to digital government services, then the question is that, I mean, you have basically a problem when you only have access to benefits if you actually are able to file your requests. But if you don't have stable internet connection, if you're not able to afford it, if you don't understand how the system works, then you don't get the benefits, or you get them much later, which might be problematic. So basically, this is like the context of what I'm analyzing, because what I find interesting is that right now you have the tendency to go online with everything, have more digital participation, more digital communication between authorities and citizens, but at the same time, the communication between authorities and citizens is not still citizen friendly. And it's most of all, it doesn't really cover all the needs of the citizens. I mean, the European Commission has actually stated that although digital government is very advanced at the moment, there are still 80 million European citizens that do not use the internet ever. And Eurostat has also some statistics on how often the internet is used to communicate with public officials. And you see that, for example, in the case of Romania, the percentage of individuals there is communicating with public authorities is just very low. It's only 15%, apparently. It's very high in other countries, but like Finland, where it's actually 91%, or in Iceland. But still, I mean, as you go digital with your services, I think it's important to take into account that not everyone is covered yet. And for example, in the Netherlands, there was this small municipality that actually decided to go fully online because they assumed that all the citizens actually did not need to go to the municipality as such. And you see that in many of these countries, that I don't know whether this is the case in Canada, because the majority of people actually have access to a computer, they have access to technology. There is the assumption that you can do everything online, everyone can do it. But the thing is, the fact that people have access to it, or they have infrastructure, doesn't mean they can actually use it. And there's quite a lot of literature from a more social science perspective in humanities that has delved into these problems of communication and access. But what I feel that is still missing is a better analysis of the different degrees of digital exclusion, why people are excluded. It's not only a matter of access, there is much more to that. It's something that very often we can only really assess in a specific situation. And it's something that has multiple legal implications. And as a lawyer, that's something that I'm interested in. So right now, what I'm presenting today is basically part of my ongoing research agenda. I'm not going to present a specific paper. I'm going to present basically a general idea of the topics I'm currently working on. And I'm happy to delve into anything that I will not mention during my presentation later in the Q&A. So these are some of the things that I find interesting and I find personally connected to the topic of digital exclusion when it comes to digitalization of public services. I think in many cases this is all connected, the lack of digital skills, the fact that we actually need to educate our children to become digital citizens. This is something that the UNESCO has been trying to underline in the last years, but we're still not there yet. We're still not educating our children to become digital citizens. And even if we are, there's still the problem that adults have not been educated as such, but they actually already have to comply with all this, with the information society. So that there is the need for more adult education on this. So digital citizenship is also one of the concepts that I'm very interested in. Digital participation, of course, because some parts of the population are more excluded than others. And also the idea that of trust in digital government, how you basically can foster trust in a society like ours. So today I'm going to focus mostly on the top layers of the circle, inclusive access and digital skills, because this top layer allows me to explain what I mean by 6 degrees of digital separation and to delve more specifically in some of the legal implications that I think we as lawyers should be discussing. So in today's talk, I will delve into 3 main points in the time that I still have. First of all, I will explain what I mean by the 6 degrees of digital separation, the legal implications that I'm particularly interested in, and how we can fix it. Whether there are simple solutions that have been adopted elsewhere. I will give the examples from France, Denmark, and UK. And whether these solutions are something that we actually can think of, and perhaps you also have some solutions from Canada that actually you would like to share with me, or elsewhere from any other country where you're currently based. So I think the first point that I'd like to make as I delve into the more specific part of my presentation is that I think it's important to move away from ongoing research, which is very valuable, but it's something that is more, it has stopped a little bit in time. Ongoing research on the idea of the digital divide as a matter of access. I think this was extremely valuable research, and we see that this research has been changing. It's research which is not mostly legal, but the thing is, right now, digital exclusion has become a much more complex phenomenon. It's not only about having access to the internet. It's actually about spectrum, about different degrees of access and participation. In fact, when you look at existing research in the field of digital media, you actually see that many authors, like for example, Joseph van Dijk, say that you don't have nowadays a digital divide, you have multiple digital divides. And these digital divides are composed by the lack of digital literacy, for example. Sometimes people feel excluded, or they don't have full access to digital government or to other digital means, because they are not able to read properly. So literacy as such is an important matter. Or they don't have access to digital means because they lack the motivation to actually do it. They don't trust government, or sometimes they just cannot do it because they only own a phone. And that is something that is important to underline, is that now with the pandemic, we have seen that many children, many households, at least in Europe, they actually could provide very minimum access to online education, because in some households there was not even a computer per household. Children were very much dependent on what they were provided at school, and that actually meant that some governments did provide some extra digital means and tools, but when that didn't happen, basically many children were dependent on how what they could actually have access to in their phones. And I even noticed it in the Netherlands, where like internet connection is usually great. Everyone has access. People have quite good skills. Even there, you actually see that not everyone is fully connected. Not everyone always has access to what you actually need to be able to participate fully, especially at a time when things have become suddenly online. So I think it's important then to also look at these different levels that actually should be the way in which we explain the digital divide nowadays, or digital exclusion, as I would prefer to refer to. So I think the first level is the one that we already know. So it's the first typical digital divide. People are excluded because they don't have access. This is something that has been solved in many countries in Europe. I believe you had the author of 1 Billion in a previous talk at Ottawa, and I think she delves mostly in the expansion of the internet in India, and I think that's a very good example where you actually see that the number of internet users has really expanded dramatically in Asia, and this first degree is actually really disappearing as we go in many countries. But the second one is still very much present in others, which is the quality and stability of the internet connection. And we see that this is actually something that is quite important to talk about, because this is something that people forget. When you actually have access to digital government, you actually need a little bit more than just access to Facebook, or minimum access to websites. You need sometimes to load data. And I think this is also something that that is important to mention. But I think it's from the third degree onwards that we actually are really talking about something that can have important implications for the legal dimension of digital inclusion. Literacy is something that we usually don't talk about as lawyers. I mean, we do when it comes to the language that we use in judgments, but in general, we lawyers tend to use very complicated language, and of course, people have to should know the law. So we don't talk about this point, but I think this is important. I mean, the Netherlands, for example, where I'm based, 20% of the population has difficulties in reading. We're not talking about digital skills. We are talking about just basic reading skills, which means that if they receive an official letter from government, they might not be able to understand it, or they might need help understanding it. If you pair that with an email with using an official database, then things become more complicated, because you basically mean that you have to have not only literacy, but also digital literacy. And that is something that actually has been explored quite well in the literature on new media studies, because you see that the ability to process information, the ability to interact with digital government, it really requires that people have a certain kind of training. But there is more to that. I think there are also other levels that are more difficult to grasp. And one of them is digital capital. Digital capital basically means that if people around you don't use the internet, they don't use digital means to communicate with government, then very often you will not do it either. You don't have your social and economic context is not actually prone to helping you in that sense. And I haven't done as much research as I would like to on digital capital. This is something that I definitely would like to explore more in the future. But I think this is something that it's a very important degree in the separation between the haves and have-nots. Because when you actually have this digital capital, which very often comes with, may come with a high income, but not necessarily, you have actually more access to information. So, for example, young people that actually are very interested in tech, in general, they might not have high income, but they might not have high education, but because they are interested, very often they tend to have a larger digital capital. While, for example, women, even with high literacy, very often, because they don't have the interest, because they don't have a network of people that is interested in the information society in general, they tend to participate less in digital society, and they actually tend to have a smaller digital capital, which actually hinders them in general in their role and visibility in society. The last one actually has to deal with the motivation that people very often lack to use digital means. So when you actually read most reports on the failure of digital government or the lack of or the exclusion of certain groups, one of the things that actually comes forward is that you see that a lot of people just simply do not want to use the digital means because they are not used to. There is just a psychological barrier. But there are also individuals that refuse to actually trust digital government because they feel that their privacy is being violated, because they just don't trust it. And I think it's interesting to think about ways in which we actually can address some of these degrees of digital exclusion and see how through legal interpretation, through the design of digital government, we can make sure that people increasingly overcome these obstacles. Because I mean, as a lawyer, of course, I will not be able to overcome the problem regarding expansion and of infrastructure, because this is something that is dependent on many other circumstances. But I think it's important to talk about the way in which we design governmental websites, the way in which we actually make sure that people are not excluded by imposing, for example, digital by default mechanisms. So when I would translate the 6 degrees of digital exclusion, this is how I would explain it, for example, to my students. So the 6 degrees basically mean that people don't have motivation, they follow what their friends and family want to do. They only have the skills to use Facebook because it's something that you actually see that many of the citizens actually that have troubles using the internet to communicate with public authorities, they are online, but they just are online in the sense that they actually can use it for purposes. And basically, there are people that have, in general, low income and low education levels, but not always. As I said, there are people who have high literacy, but because of their age, for example, or their lack of motivation, they just don't really feel prone to actually using the systems. So as I said, what I find interesting in this discussion regarding digital exclusion is not only the different degrees, the reasons why people do not have access to digital government or have trouble having access to digital government, but actually what happens when they don't. When citizens don't have access to digital government, they cannot use a number of rights. First of all, I think it's important to think about due process. I work a lot with administrative law. It's my field of research. And then I see that when you actually have the right to apply for social welfare benefits, there are, of course, certain steps that have to be taken. What you actually see is that certain systems, automatic systems, will fill in certain steps. There will be an algorithm that will fill in certain steps if the citizen cannot provide information. And this often happens because the citizen doesn't even understand what's actually being asked. And for example, in Australia, it has been found that in some cases, the information that was being assumed was actually quite discriminatory. And in England, you also see that with the universal credit welfare system, which is basically all online, it has become difficult for citizens who cannot use the internet to actually fill in the system. I mean, I tried to fill in the form myself, and I mean, I could fill it in, but a lot of the data is being asked, and I can imagine that it can be complicated for this. So from the moment that you actually don't know how the system works, you may provide information that can be used against you. Might provide information that is incorrect, and and because of this mistake, you might be sanctioned afterwards. So in that sense, in terms of administrative protection before public authorities, you can actually be put in a quite difficult position because you ought to provide truthful information to the authorities. So in this case, I think it's quite complicated. Due process is also something that is important because when it comes to social welfare benefits, and especially when it comes to social welfare fraud, I think there has been quite a lot of discussion, especially in the Netherlands, as you probably know, regarding the use of automated systems to identify potential individuals that are potentially committing fraud. And of course, the system has not been approved, so it's not going to be used in practice. But we know that in many countries there are lists, there are ways of finding individuals through algorithms that have actually that actually can potentially raise some red flags. I believe there is quite a big of a gap between those people that actually are filling in the information and might not be actually aware of what can raise a red flag. Sometimes these are things that they cannot control, like their name, the country where they were born, for example. But I believe that there is a gap between what the public authorities know and what they know has become even bigger now, because with the use of automation, we know that this is actually becoming problematic. But this is an issue that has been actually, it is currently being analyzed in literature quite extensively. Another issue that I think is important to mention is that you also see the problem of public values not being preserved in this context, because very often digital government relies heavily upon private technology developed by big tech companies. This is also the case of many social welfare systems that are actually being, bought and then adapted. And the thing is, when you actually have a system which has been developed by a private company, it might be a little bit difficult to make sure that this system really preserves the public values that digital government ought to protect. And this is something that I find quite difficult. But I think the most important legal implication of digital exclusion in the case of digital government is definitely it's the violation of the right to equal treatments. Even though we are only referring in some cases 20% of the population, this 20% population has the right to choose between offline and online public services. And this is something that I believe it's important to talk about, because these are people that need the government to provide them essential public services, benefits, and these are people that are actually being discriminated in a way, because for them it is probably disproportionate to require that they actually acquire all the skills they would need to actually interact with digital governments. They might not be literally being discriminated, but they are being unequally treated because they simply cannot, at their age, for example, learn how certain systems work. They cannot understand how things are processed. And I think it's important to see digital exclusion in a way as a new form of inequality, a form of inequality that in part reproduces social, economic, political inequalities and political problems that we already have in our society, but it also amplifies them. So I don't think we can fix it, but I think it's important to think about ways in which we can understand better this problem. So as I said, I don't have a solution for this yet, at least, but I'm thinking of ways in which we can address it. So in the context of this project on digital exclusion, there are different steps that I would like to or different projects that I would like to analyze. So beyond the idea of exploring the concept of digital exclusion and its legal dimension, I am currently working or are thinking of different options that we can actually draw inspiration from and see whether they actually can help us improve the inclusion of citizens, or at least help citizens trust digital government more. So one of the things that might be one of the solutions that you might be familiar with, especially the French speakers among you, is the so-called droit à l'erreur, or the right to make a mistake, which is something that has been recently adopted in France a couple of years ago. And this right promises more than it delivers. But this idea is basically that if you want to actually increase trust in governments, you actually need to allow citizens to make mistakes, as long as these mistakes are made in good faith. We know actually that 9 out of 10 citizens actually make mistakes submitting their tax declarations. And this is just a number that has been given without taking into account all the online difficulties. In practice, a lot of people make mistakes because they just don't know how to file their benefits. And some people are not even able to fully do it because of their digital illiteracy. But the thing is, while some countries are quite lenient when people make mistakes in filing tax benefits, other countries are not. And this might actually mean that you actually get a penalty. So because of this lack of clarity regarding making mistakes, administrative mistakes, the reluctance of people regarding digital government, this right to make a mistake, which was adopted by Macron, was one of his promises, actually could sound like a good solution. if you look closely at the law, you actually will see that in France, it's not really a big solution because it only applies in very limited areas. But I like the idea. I like the idea of having a right to make a mistake, because at least if you have that right, and if you shape it in a different way, not the same way that the French did it, but in a broader way, this could be a way of ensuring that more citizens participate in digital governments, that citizens actually feel that they can, that there is a way of being forgiven if you make a mistake, if you can't file your taxes, that the computer is not always saying no when you actually can't fill in all the forms. And I think this is something that I would be happy to discuss with you, because I think this idea of having a lenient administration is something that goes very well along with the idea of digital inclusion, with the idea of having a digital government that is constantly being improved, that adopts and embraces experiments. So this is something that I personally think it could be a solution for the existing problems in digital exclusion, and especially for the problem of the lack of trust and lack of motivation when it comes to engaging with digital governments. Another issue that, or another policy measure that has been adopted in Denmark and UK, which is a little bit less legal, but it could definitely be used to address some of the legal issues, is the so-called assisted digital. So assisted digital is basically a program that ensures that people that have some difficulties using digital government, they can still participate in society by receiving some assistance. This assistance could be a chatbot that looks that accompanies the process and makes sure people actually fill all the forms, or show some information, or it could be actually someone who actually really helps you fill in a form. And this could be particularly helpful when it comes to people that can't read properly. So digital assistance is something that I believe many digital inclusion departments, at least in the Netherlands and UK and Denmark, are really thinking about. But I think we still don't have enough discussion on how this actually should be implemented. Also because when I talk to municipalities, I also have the feeling that there are actually not enough means. Very often this assistance comes from voluntary work, from charities that actually have people that want to help, but very often this help doesn't come on time. And I think having a more structured program that actually could help citizens really be assisted could be helpful, because it would ensure that citizens really could also use digital government without the fear of making a mistake, once again, because there would be someone to help them. So this is something that from policy perspective could help. I think as a last remark regarding the solutions, because I think my time is already, like, I am approaching at least the end of my time. I think it's one of the main takeaways from my current research has been that I think it's important to invest in education when it comes to digital government, to educate citizens to become digital citizens, but also to educate public authorities regarding digital exclusion. Because my feeling is that a lot of citizens actually are not aware that there is a percentage of other citizens that actually cannot engage with technology. We probably have heard that there are many senior citizens that cannot, and I believe I saw someone in the audience who had a grandma or aunt who had some issues because she wanted to pay something for her visitors, and she couldn't because everything was a parking a ticket, and basically she couldn't because everything had to be done through an app, a smartphone app, and she didn't have a smartphone app, and she didn't know how to install it. So she actually was incurring a fine, pretty fine, because she didn't download the app on time and she didn't know how to. And I think this is an example of how things that are just so simple, like reserving a parking spot, even submitting a very simple benefit. These are things that could be done so easily, and now because they have become online, they are very easy for all of us here taking place in this conversation. But they might be very difficult for people that don't work remotely, that have troubles writing or reading. And I think there should be a way to do it, because when you actually look at commercial websites like Facebook or Instagram, they're extremely easy to use. The user experience is very friendly. But the digital government hasn't gotten there, also because information is more complex, of course. But I think it's important to talk about how we could more inclusive designs of digital governments, and actually of ways in which we can make sure that citizens understand what kind of information is being asked, how this information can be used against them in case they don't provide it correctly, and also how they can be protected in case they make mistakes. So I really look forward to your questions, and thanks again for the opportunity to present my project here.
Thank you very much, Sofia. That was super interesting. So maybe I'm just gonna remove the slides so we can see both of us a bit better. So I would invite people to ask their questions in the chat. We have already some questions and some comments about the Canadian situation that I'm going to try to reframe as questions to you, Sofia, so we can have a conversation. But so yeah, it was super interesting, and I really liked your 6 degrees of separations. And as you know, I've been working on that topic as well with my colleague Elizabeth Dubois, and especially about the Canadian context, because so we need research globally on those issues, but especially in Canada, and with and so right now we're leading a multi-stakeholder initiative titled Connected Canada, with a book. We just released the preprint. Actually, we will announce tomorrow on Twitter that the preprint are online, with many chapters discussing what you said. And one of the things we're saying with Elizabeth in the introduction, and also in the chapter we published for a book by Bill Dutton, is that basically today, yeah, it's not so much digital citizenship, it's just that citizenship is no digital, because when we have the other algorithm and digital tools nudge your civic participation, use the way you can enact your citizenship, as you mentioned, at the end of your talk. But for some services, if you don't have your smartphone, you just cannot interact with your government, or and a system will make decision for you, even if you decide to be fully not connected. You can't, because government will use algorithmic decision making against or for you. So yeah. Anyway, it's not just me and you in conversation. So let's go take some questions. And one of the first comment we received was someone referring, to the banks and the private actors who are basically getting in the surveillance business with banking, or with some providers. If you want to bank with them, you basically need to give them all the information about you, and they can share that with third parties. And so maybe if you could discuss this, and maybe expand on so I think it's your 5th degree, digital capital, and maybe if you could explain a bit more what you meant by this. And when I was listening to you, I was wondering if you were maybe referring to some of the work by other scholars, such as for example on surveillance, capitalism, etc. So you're still muted. I think you muted yourself.
I actually have been talking the whole time. I was so thank you very much for the comment. So digital capital, actually, in this case, is not referred to surveillance capitalism and this literature. Actually, it comes more from humanities, from new media studies. I actually don't have the reference right now, but I can definitely provide to you later. And it actually has more to do with the idea with social capital. So it's basically a way of translating the idea of social capital to the world of digital, by basically saying you are in the digital world who you get along with. So your digital network will basically, make sure that you actually are better or worse off in online, but also your social network will do the same. So it has to do with the idea of social capital, and how also your more economic, political, and social status, actually. And so that's the reason why you see that in the case of women, I mean, there are a lot of people that say, yeah, but the internet is really empowering women. Well, no, it's not yet empowering women. It's not definitely empowering girls, because women are still more often than men trolled online. They are more sensitive to that. There is more gender-based violence online, and basically because women with each other, they basically use other kinds of online communication. The digital capital is different from the digital capital of a young, boy that is more tech savvy, that is more interested in these kind of things. So the digital capital has to do with that, with the social capital, actually. You asked also about private actors, about the fact, well, if you partner up with a private actor as a public authority, then you have to accept the terms. That is one of the big problems, especially in smart cities. You see that, I mean, Toronto had a big experience with that failed. But that's a problem that you see quite a lot, that you buy technology because it's cheaper to buy it from a private partner. It's usually better developed. But the thing is, then you have the problem of the public values that may be lost when you partner up. So that is an issue that has been raised in different areas. And it is true that sometimes you have to accept it, but you don't have to accept everything, because at the end of the day, public authorities are on the demand side. It's public procurements. And I think it is really important when it comes to public procurements that actually some very strict rules are set when it comes to data collection, protection of citizen rights. And there are some people that have been doing some research on this, but I think it's important to do more research on when it comes to imposing fair and citizen-friendly terms in public contracts. So that when you associate yourself with big tech companies and also small tech companies, that the public interest goes above private interests.
Okay. I'm going to try. So someone have made many comments about the situation about Canada and highlighting that, yes, indeed. So we have many digital divides in Canada. One of them being access, but as you said, access is not everything, because if people don't know how to use it or do not have the tools, even though they theoretically can connect, they can't. And so we have this issue in Canada, and often like the EU is seen as being like super well connected, as well of the UK, although so that person highlight that not everything might be perfect ever. And maybe could you share like some thought about those kind of access issues in some remote areas, like in Scotland, and linked to this, I'm trying to summarize the comments, and also with the private actors. So that person is highlighting, remembering us that, like in the past, beyond the state, you had some non-profit organization, or like the church, supporting citizens in understanding their rights, etc. So now that we're moving everything online, how do you see this, especially in remote areas? Should it be maybe, like a digital strategy for government to reinvest in those, like kind of the internet cafe that we basically put on the side? Maybe it's time to go back to this with, like people, but should it be private actors? Should it be government, like supporting citizens to be able to, to enact, the basic rights?
I actually love the idea of internet cafes. I actually when I was a kid, of course, you had them everywhere. I mean, probably the same, in your case. And I haven't seen them. I thought there weren't any more internet cafes, actually. But it was funny because when I was visiting Nepal 2 years ago, I actually saw that there you have quite a lot of places. Like you still have in Asia, you actually see that quite a lot. And they are essential. They're really essential for populations. So in that sense, I think it would be important. I also like the idea that you referred to the church, because I think we very often forget that once upon a time there was no state, or the state was just the army and taxation. The state didn't do anything. It was just basically like collecting taxes and protecting citizens from, or protecting themselves, the territory from invasions. And the church had a crucial role in, because they were evangelizing population, they were educating the population, they were providing healthcare. So of course nowadays it would be a little bit strange to ask churches and missionaries to go and educate people about digital technology. Although the church has evolved quite a lot when it comes to like providing, like masses online and everything, but I don't think we should think about that. But I think it is important to perhaps think about these charities, these NGOs. For example, in UK, there is one called, I think it's All Good Things. And actually, they only do work on digital exclusion. So also Scotland, in Scotland, there's a huge problem with children that actually don't have access to, they even have problems with transportation and mobility is a huge issue, but also like, access to internet. So I think having this kind of actors, these charities would be also very important, but also developing more public interest technology. And public interest technology can also be developed not only by public parties, as we have been talking about, but also like big tech companies could also invest a little bit more on charities themselves that actually could have things more like zero rating. We don't talk about zero rating that much in developed countries, but perhaps we should. Perhaps this could also be a way of overcoming problems of access in rural areas, because Canada is a very big country with a lot of rural areas that probably have also these issues.
Yeah, no, zero rating is it's like a touchy topic, because it from a consumer perspective, at first it looks amazing, but like from a competent perspective, then like
it's terrible. Yeah.
Work we create internet.org for the global south, where it's, as you said, it's basically, people know to use the internet, no, they just know to use Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. But we should ask ourselves why Facebook has done this. But the thing is, why only Facebook? Of course they have the means, but digital governments should also create their own platforms like Facebook, because people can use it.
Yeah, no, so like digital service design, like in government, is essential. And actually, so in the Canadian context, a few years ago, the federal government, as well as some provincial ones, they launched like special units with UX experts to help develop like tools that citizens could use.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so maybe the next question I will go to is about that educational burden. Like who should take care of this? And so when it comes to digital literacy in areas, so I would say within digital government services delivery, but also outside of this, who do you think the educational burden lies with? Should the government be responsible for teaching citizens how to use those services? Should it be part of the maybe of the official curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it should. Actually, like in the Netherlands, there are some primary schools that actually already have digital skills in their curriculum. So the Ministry of Interior and Education, I think also the Ministry of Education, partnered up with Disney. So they have there is this program that is done, with basically not Mickey Mouse, but I think it's Donald Duck. So Donald Duck explains how to use the internet. And basically Donald Duck shows that you shouldn't post certain pictures on Facebook of yourself. So the idea is to also educate children to be responsible when it comes to internet usage. So I know that this kind of very basic kind of like forms are starting, but shouldn't we also teach our children to code a little bit? There are so many skills that we should also already be introducing. So I definitely think the government should do it. Because this is not just it's not just indoctrination, it's just providing skills for life, the same way we teach our kids to read, and so it's basic for the future. So I think it should be government. I'm actually working on an article on the right to education, where I actually argue together with a colleague of mine that the right to education should encompass nowadays digital education, because the children of the future, they will actually need them to get a job. for the employability. The European Commission has said that without digital skills, people will be unemployable in the coming decades. So I think it is part of the right to education.
Yeah, and as we've seen with the current pandemic, or almost like overnight, we all moved online with presenting like new challenges, and this is something that you actually wrote in one of your icon blog with the risk of like creating a two-tier society with the one who can connect, or at least who can understand, how to use the tool, and the others. And I think that goes back to that idea of digital assistance as a governmental duties. I really like this, and some people were commenting in the chat about, especially like the veterans, or like and at large, like the older generations in the population that needs to do everything online. They never had to. And so for the veterans to be able to get their pension, they need to register online, but nobody out there to explain to them how to do so. And so that person really liked your idea of like digital assistance, and many other examples were like giving in the chat. I think it's something that government should look into.
But you don't have that in Canada, do you?
No. Well, there is some initiatives, and the government have been funding one way or the other some initiative, especially in the north. But last year, a government panel of like independent experts released a big report that was widely discussed for many reasons. But one of the chapter I really liked is a full chapter on digital literacy and the need for Canada to invest to make sure that we don't create that two-tier society, that we don't just invest in connecting, like the south of the country. We have kind of like the very, very south of the country by the US border, very well connected, almost by the big cities. But yeah, when you go, like Canada is huge, and when you leave that kind of belt, you need to rely on like pro satellite connection, and even in the big cities, the price of internet access, especially right now, like if you want to spend your days on Zoom, Teams, Google Hangouts, it's just for some people they cannot afford this. So that's an issue.
But I mean, I only know about the US, but even in the US, it's outside big cities, it's really pricey to have actually access to high-speed internet. So actually, when I was living in the US, I really realized that the access that we have to the internet in Europe is actually very, very reasonably priced and very fast, actually.
Yeah, and another comment that in the chat was that it seems that going digital is often used to offer actually like less transparency and client service to customers and citizens. Just use our like cell app. And so that person is mentioning an example with the Transit Corporation in Toronto, who removed previously posted like bus, the bus schedules at stop, and like, oh yeah, go to social media or third-party transit, where like they can just update the data, and so there is not that usual accountability. But yeah, at the same time, that it can offers some new opportunities. But yeah, in that case, like for the elderly, customers, they can't see the schedule, etc. So that can propose.
But I think that's a very good comment, very fair and good comment, because you actually see that that's exactly what happens, that when you actually have everything goes, everything becomes automated, you also don't know what's behind it. I mean, of course, government has always had secret lists and secret guidance. So, for example, this right to make a mistake in France was adopted because there was a complaint from the French ombudsman regarding certain policy documents that were guiding certain guidances. There were guiding welfare fraud investigations that were only available to the civil servants, and they included things like, if you have a name that sounds like you were born outside the European Union, that raises a red flag, so you should be investigated. And these were secret documents. I mean, of course, now it's around, nowadays it would be an algorithm, of course. But these were things that were not transparent to citizens either. You couldn't have access to this information as a citizen before. But the thing is, there was still someone that would actually look at it and check something else. And there was still the human dimension. And now everything would probably be automated. But I mean, this has been officially forbidden in France. But this is actually a bit of the background of this, like statute on trust in digital governments, in government.
Oh yeah, no, indeed. And maybe maybe of a last question, because I'm mindful of the time. Once someone was wondering if you could discuss a bit or like expand on if and how this the framework you're proposing could apprehend the digital divide in terms of data representation. So low representation of concerned communities in the data, and I think you touch upon a bit that issue in your introductory remarks, data desert and the impacts in terms of bias, especially in the context where like we are increasingly relying on big data sets to frame public policy. And you refer to previous virtual talk, and yeah, so we had Paella Roja coming to share like findings in India and Africa, as well as Nagla Risk about
Oh yeah,
like
I know her as well.
and Middle East. So yeah, maybe like from your perspective, from your ongoing research, if you could share your thoughts
So
about
what is the question is more focused on
yeah,
this of big data? I didn't get the question that well.
yeah, data representation. So like
Data representation.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean that is a big issue. So also like it's a big issue because when it comes to so when the data is actually when the data sets that are fed into the system already are quite limited, this has quite a lot of impacts in the results that you obtain. So I think it's important to really talk about data justice in the sense as well, and make sure that there are, from like a statistical perspective, you need to have more corrective elements, more corrective variables that are introduced into the system to make sure that people do not get discriminated because of historical data is not taken into account, for example. So I don't know if the question was in that sense, but I think when we want to include people in general and make them feel comfortable with using digital governments, I think it's important that I mean, as I said before, public authorities are educated for regarding the need for these variables, to design systems that are inclusive, but also the need to include data that is actually complete and that is corrected for historical moments. I think in the US it has been discussed quite extensively when it comes to discrimination of Afro Americans in the prison system, for example, or Latinos. I think this is probably a very big case, but I think in Europe we are seeing exactly the same. I mean, in the Netherlands we have the problem with migrants from Morocco and Turkey that have been consistently discriminated, and there was a very big scandal here because the data was not complete, and there were so many biases against them that almost always, like, the government would find fraud against them, and that just showed how incomplete the data sets were.
yeah, no, but yeah, data representation is essential when like the government start to make not just, so it's important when it's the bank, the corporate actors, but when it's the government starting to make like important decision about like your rights and your,
Yeah,
like, your
because you're not a
benefits.
consumer. I think it's important to say that. I mean, with a bank, you are a consumer. If you don't like the bank, you can go to another bank.
Yeah.
But with government, you only have one government. You only have one provider of social welfare benefits. So government, more than ever, needs to have transparency regarding the way in which decisions are made, because you don't have a choice, and you have rights that are constitutionally awarded to you. And I think that's the big difference between a private actor and a public actor.
No, indeed, and more you see government acting as corporate actors with long-term and condition a la Facebook to access
Exactly.
their services with data just that
But not with the digital easiness of use of Facebook, the citizen friendlyship that Facebook is extremely easy to use. extremely easy to, I mean, not the privacy policies, but when it comes to the usage, it's quite easy. But we don't have that. So it would be good if government would actually do that, draw inspiration from the good things that Facebook and Instagram have.
Exactly. Anyway, I think because it's 1:05, we will need to stop here. But I feel we could continue that conversation for hours today. And for you, it's already like the evening. So thank you again so much, Sofia, for joining us today and for sharing your ongoing research. I hope we will have the opportunity to collaborate on some of those topics. And thank you to everybody who joined us today on the chat. So probably by tomorrow, by the end of the week, the video will be online on our YouTube channel. And yeah, and it was our last virtual talk for the summer. We're gonna all take a small break, at least until like the end of August and the beginning of orientation at the University of Ottawa, and be certain that even though Ottawa campus will remain closed in the fall due to the COVID-19 pandemic, CLTS will start again its virtual programming, and we'll continue to welcome thought leaders from around the globe to exchange on the societal implication of technology. So on that note, have all a lovely remaining of the day, and thank you again, Sofia, for being with us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.